The photograph in the wallet. The morning sunlight pierced through the expansive windows of Stanton Enterprises, a monolithic skyscraper that dominated the city skyline. Inside the top-floor office, Edward Langston, the company's ruthless CEO, sat reviewing financial reports with an air of indifference. His reputation as a heartless businessman preceded him, a man driven by profit margins and devoid of sentimentality. His office mirrored this coldness: sleek, minimalist furniture, and the absence of any personal touches, except for one peculiar item. In his leather wallet, hidden from sight, was an old photograph. The edges were frayed, and the colors had faded, but the image of a young girl with wide, innocent eyes remained vivid. Edward never showed the photograph to anyone. It was a ghost from his past, a burden he carried silently, even as he conquered the corporate world. The day began like any other, with his assistant, Monica Hill, stepping into the room briskly. Monica had worked for Edward for over a decade, enduring his perfectionism and icy demeanor. But this morning, she noticed something unusual, a fleeting moment of hesitation as he adjusted his tie. "Sir, the board is waiting," Monica said, placing a stack of papers on his desk. Edward nodded but didn't rise immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward his wallet, where the photograph resided. After a brief pause, he stood and followed her to the boardroom. Meanwhile, across the city, a lively buzz filled the air at the Street Helena Orphanage, a home for abandoned children. Among them was Leela Grace, a spirited 11-year-old known for her creativity and warmth. Though life had been unkind, Leela possessed an unyielding optimism, often lifting the spirits of her friends at the orphanage. That morning, Leela stumbled upon an old box in the storage room containing a stack of photographs. She picked up one and froze. It was a picture of a baby wrapped in a pink blanket, labeled with a date and the name Grace. The resemblance to her younger self was undeniable. Questions flooded her mind. Who took this photo? Why was it hidden here? Though the orphanage had been her home for as long as she could remember, the mystery of her origins remained a puzzle. Back at Stanton Enterprises, the board meeting progressed without incident until Edward made an unexpected announcement. "This year, Stanton Enterprises will host a charity gala," he said, his voice firm. "The proceeds will benefit the Street Helena Orphanage." The room fell silent. Edward Langston, the man infamous for his lack of empathy, was now championing a cause for orphans. The board exchanged skeptical glances, but Edward's authority was absolute. No one dared question him. Monica, however, couldn't hide her curiosity. After the meeting, she approached him cautiously. "Street Helena Orphanage, sir. Is there a reason you chose them?" Edward's jaw tightened. "It's the right thing to do," he replied curtly, dismissing her with a wave. The announcement of the gala reached the orphanage within days, sparking excitement among the children. It was an opportunity for them to experience a world far removed from their modest lives. Leela, however, was preoccupied with the photo she had found. Late at night, she confided in her closest friend, Emily, a pragmatic girl with a sharp mind. "It's strange, Emily," Leela whispered, showing her the photograph. "Do you think someone at the gala might know about this?" Emily studied the photo and then Leela. "Maybe. But why would someone important care about us? We're just kids in an orphanage." On the night of the gala, the children arrived at the opulent venue in borrowed clothes, their eyes wide with wonder. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and tables were laden with more food than they had ever seen. Leela, clutching the photo in her pocket, felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. As the event unfolded, Edward Langston made his obligatory rounds, greeting guests with polite disinterest. But when his eyes landed on Leela across the room, his expression changed. Time seemed to freeze as recognition struck him like a bolt of lightning. She looked exactly like the baby in his photograph. The same wide eyes, the same inquisitive gaze. Unable to contain himself, Edward approached her. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than usual. "What's your name?" "Leela. she replied, her voice steady despite the intimidating presence of the towering CEO. Who are you? Before he could answer, the photograph slipped from her pocket and fluttered to the ground. Edward picked it up and stared at it, his face ashen. Where did you get this? He demanded, his voice trembling. It was in the orphanage, Leela said, her brow furrowing. Why do you have the same picture? Edward sank to his knees, the weight of decades of guilt and regret crashing down on him. I'm so sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I should have been there. I should have protected you. Leela stepped back, her mind racing. What do you mean? Protected me from what? The room seemed to spin as Edward struggled to find the words. How could he explain the choices that had led to this moment? The powerful CEO, a man feared and respected by all, was now a broken figure begging for forgiveness from the one person he had wronged the most. The unveiling of secrets. Leela's breath caught as she stared at the man kneeling before her, his powerful frame crumbling under the weight of emotions she couldn't yet comprehend. The grand ballroom, filled with laughter and conversation, faded into a blur. The other children from the orphanage continued exploring the lavish surroundings, oblivious to the moment unfolding between Leela and Edward Langston. Leela tightened her grip on the photograph in her hand. What are you talking about? You don't even know me, she said, her voice wavering despite her attempt to sound strong. Edward looked up at her, his usually sharp, calculating eyes soft and filled with tears. I do know you, Leila. You're my daughter. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, jolting Leela out of her daze. She shook her head, taking a step back. No, that's not true. That can't be true. Her voice rose, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. Edward remained on his knees, his hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. It is true, Leila, and I've been carrying this secret for years, too afraid to face the consequences of my actions. But seeing you here tonight, I can't hide from it anymore. A surge of emotions swept through Leila. Confusion, anger, disbelief. She felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. If that's true, she said, her voice trembling, then why did you leave me? Why didn't you want me? Edward flinched as if struck. The raw pain in her words pierced through him, shattering whatever composure he had left. It wasn't that I didn't want you, he began, his voice hoarse. It was complicated. I made mistakes, selfish ones, and I thought I was protecting you by staying away. Leela's hands balled into fists. Protecting me. I grew up in an orphanage. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep wondering if someone out there cared about me? Edward opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Monica appeared at his side, her face pale with worry. Sir, is everything all right? People are starting to notice. Edward rose shakily to his feet, his towering presence restored, but his vulnerability remained evident. He glanced around the room, realizing that whispers had indeed begun to ripple through the crowd. We need to talk, he said to Leela, his tone urgent but gentle. Privately. I don't want to talk to you, Leela snapped, her voice breaking. You don't get to show up out of nowhere and expect me to just forgive you. Please, Edward begged. Just give me a chance to explain, to tell you everything. Monica placed a steadying hand on his arm. Perhaps it would be better if we handled this somewhere quieter, she suggested diplomatically. Leela, would you feel comfortable speaking with Mr. Langston in a private room? Leela hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She wanted answers, but she didn't trust him. Not yet. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay, but only for a few minutes. They were ushered into a smaller, elegantly furnished sitting room adjacent to the ballroom. Edward paced nervously, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Leila sat stiffly on the edge of a plush armchair, her expression guarded. I don't even know where to begin, Edward admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd get the chance to tell you this. Start with the truth, Leila said coldly. Why wasn't I enough for you? Edward stopped pacing and turned to face her. You were always enough, Lila. But I wasn't. I was young, ambitious, and terrified. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. I told her that I couldn't be involved. Lila's eyes widened. You abandoned her. He winced at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. I did, and it's the greatest regret of my life. I told myself it was for the best, that I couldn't give her or you the life you deserved. But the truth is, I was a coward. Lila's lip quivered as she absorbed his words. What happened to her? To my mother? Edward's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair. She passed away shortly after you were born. I didn't even know until months later. By then, you'd been placed in the orphanage. I wanted to come for you, but I was too ashamed. I thought you'd be better off without me. Tears streamed down Lila's cheeks. Better off. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up wondering why no one wanted you? To feel like you don't belong anywhere? Edward's voice broke as he replied. I do now, and I hate myself for not being there for you. But I want to change that, Lila. If you'll let me, I want to be in your life. Lila stared at him, her emotions a tangled knot of anger, sadness, and longing. Part of her wanted to reject him outright, to make him feel the pain she had endured. But another part of her, a small, fragile part, yearned for the connection she had always craved. Why now? She asked softly. Why are you telling me this now? Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph. Because I've carried this picture with me for years, and every time I looked at it, I felt the weight of my failure. When I saw you tonight, I knew I couldn't run from the truth any longer. Lila took the photograph from him, studying the image of herself as a baby. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would have been like to grow up with a father, to have someone who loved her unconditionally. The thought brought a fresh wave of tears. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Edward nodded, his expression filled with anguish. I don't expect you to. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right, no matter how long it takes. Lila looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. Then prove it, she said. Don't just say you're sorry. Show me. Edward met her gaze, determination hardening his features. I will. I promise. As they rejoined the gala, the weight of their conversation lingered between them. Lila kept her distance, retreating to the group of children from the orphanage. Edward watched her from afar, his heart heavy with the knowledge that rebuilding her trust would be the greatest challenge of his life. That night, as Lila lay in her bunk at the orphanage, she clutched the photograph tightly. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, could he really be the father I've always dreamed of? Or is this just another broken promise waiting to happen? A test of promises. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of emotion for Lila. Edward Langston's sudden declaration had shaken the foundation of everything she thought she knew about herself. Questions plagued her mind. Why did he choose now to come forward? Could someone who abandoned her mother ever truly care about her? Edward, on the other hand, felt the full weight of the promises he had made. For years, his life had been meticulously structured around his career and public image. Now, he found himself navigating unfamiliar territory, driven by an earnest desire to reconnect with the daughter he had forsaken. At Street Helena Orphanage, Lila sat in the art room, staring at a blank canvas. Normally, she found solace in painting, but today her mind was too cluttered. Her closest friend, Emily, sat across from her, working on a colorful collage. You haven't touched your brushes, Emily observed, her voice cautious. Still thinking about him? Lila nodded, chewing on her bottom lip. He says he wants to make things right, that he wants to be part of my life. But how can I believe him? He's had all this time. Emily shrugged, gluing another piece of paper to her project. People can change, Lila. Maybe he really means it. Lila frowned. But what if he doesn't? What if this is just another letdown? Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe you don't have to decide all at once. Let him prove it. That afternoon, Edward arrived at the orphanage, carrying a box filled with supplies. New art kits, canvases, and brushes. He had spent hours researching what children Lila's age might enjoy, determined to show her he was serious about his intentions. Mrs. Harper, the orphanage director, greeted him at the door with a warm but cautious smile. "Mr. Langston, we appreciate your generosity. The children will love these supplies." "I'm glad," Edward replied, glancing nervously around the room. "Is Lila here?" "I was hoping to see her." Mrs. Harper nodded. "She's in the art room. But I should warn you, she's still processing everything. Be patient with her." Edward took a deep breath and made his way to the art room. When he entered, Lila froze mid-stroke, her brush hovering over the canvas. Emily looked between them, her eyes wide with curiosity, before muttering something about needing more glue and slipping out of the room. "Hi," Edward said softly, placing the box on the table. "I brought something for you and the other kids. I thought you might like to try some new art supplies." Lila glanced at the box, her expression unreadable. "Thanks, I guess." Edward hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "What are you working on?" "Nothing," Lila replied curtly, setting her brush down. "I wasn't really in the mood." "I understand," Edward said, though he felt a pang of disappointment. "Art was my mother's favorite pastime. She always said it was a way to express the things words couldn't." Lila's eyes flicked toward him, surprised by the personal admission. "Your mom liked art." Edward nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She was amazing at it. She used to paint these beautiful landscapes, full of color and life. I wasn't very good at it, but she always encouraged me to try." For the first time, Layla's curiosity outweighed her frustration. "What happened to her?" "She passed away when I was about your age," Edward said quietly. "I think losing her made me afraid to care about anyone else. I didn't want to feel that kind of pain again, but I was wrong to let that fear control me." Lila studied him carefully, her defenses slightly lowered. "Why did you bring me these things? You don't have to buy stuff to make up for what you did." Edward sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table. "I know I can't erase the past, Lila, but I want to show you that I'm here to stay, that I care about what makes you happy." Lila's gaze softened, but her guard remained up. "You can't just buy forgiveness." "I don't expect to," Edward admitted. "But maybe if I show you I'm serious, we can find a way forward. Together." Over the next few weeks, Edward made frequent visits to the orphanage. He volunteered during story time, helped with chores, and even joined the children in a game of soccer, though his clumsy attempts earned him more laughter than points. At first, Lila kept her distance, observing him from afar. But gradually, she began to engage, testing his sincerity with small acts of inclusion. She invited him to watch her paint, asked his opinion on her artwork, and even challenged him to a game of chess. One afternoon, Edward arrived with an old, weathered sketchbook tucked under his arm. "I wanted to show you something," he said as he handed it to Lila. She opened it to find pages filled with sketches, some clumsy and others surprisingly detailed. "These are yours?" she asked, surprised. Edward nodded, smiling sheepishly. "From when I was younger. I used to sketch when I needed to clear my mind. I thought you might like to see them." Lila flipped through the pages, her fingers lingering on a sketch of a sunrise over a mountain range. "This one's pretty good," she admitted, a hint of admiration in her voice. Edward chuckled. "It's my favorite. I drew it after my mom, and I went on a camping trip. She woke me up at dawn to see the sunrise. I hated getting up that early, but it was worth it." Lila smiled faintly, imagining the scene. For the first time, she saw glimpses of a man who wasn't just a cold, detached CEO, but someone who had once been a boy with dreams and fears, much like her. Despite Edward's efforts, not everyone at the orphanage was convinced of his sincerity. Some of the staff viewed his actions as little more than an attempt to ease his guilt. Mrs. Harper, however, saw the changes in Leela, the way she had begun to smile more, her growing confidence, and chose to give Edward the benefit of the doubt. One evening, as the children gathered for a movie night, Mrs. Harper pulled Edward aside. "I can see you're trying, Mr. Langston," she said, "but you should know that Lila's trust is fragile. She's been let down before. Don't make promises you can't keep." Edward met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I won't. I've spent too many years running from my responsibilities. I'm not running anymore." As the weeks turned into months, Edward continued to prove himself. He arranged for renovations at the orphanage, ensuring the children had a comfortable place to live. He also began taking small steps to integrate Leela into his world, inviting her to visit his office and introducing her to his team. Leela, though cautious, found herself warming to him. One day, she surprised him by asking, "Do you really think I could paint something as good as your sunrise sketch?" Edward smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I think you could paint something even better." For the first time, Leela allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the man who had once abandoned her could become the father she had always wished for. The cracks in the facade. Months passed, and the once fragile connection between Edward and Leela began to take shape. Their tentative bond had started to heal some of the old wounds, but the past has a way of surfacing at the most unexpected moments. While Leela grew cautiously optimistic about her relationship with Edward, she couldn't entirely silence the doubts that whispered in the back of her mind. The air was crisp as winter gave way to spring, and the courtyard of Street Helena Orphanage buzzed with activity. Edward had organized a garden renovation project, a joint effort between the orphanage staff and some volunteers from Stanton Enterprises. Layla watched from a shaded bench as Edward, clad in work gloves and a Stanton Enterprises ball cap, struggled to plant a row of roses. "You're doing it all wrong," she called out, a mischievous grin playing on her lips. Edward glanced up, his face smeared with dirt. "You think you can do better?" "Definitely," Lila replied, hopping off the bench and marching over to him. She crouched down and adjusted one of the rose bushes. "You're supposed to spread the roots out. Otherwise, it won't grow right." Edward watched her work, his chest swelling with pride. "You're a natural." Leela shrugged, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Miss Harper taught me. We planted the vegetable garden last year." "I'll have to ask her for lessons," Edward said with a chuckle. "Maybe then my roses won't look so sad." For a brief moment, Leela felt the walls around her heart soften. But as she glanced up, her eyes caught sight of two staff members whispering nearby. One of them, Mrs. Harper's assistant, shot a pointed look in Edward's direction before quickly turning away. Leela frowned. "Why are they always whispering when you're here?" Edward followed her gaze but shook his head dismissively. "Don't worry about them. They're probably just not used to seeing me dig in the dirt." Leela wasn't convinced, but she let the matter drop. For now, a letter that changes everything. The next day, as Leela sorted through the mail with Mrs. Harper, an envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to the orphanage, but marked with Stanton Enterprises logo. Leela hesitated before handing it over. "Mr. Langston has been very generous," Mrs. Harper said, noticing Leila's hesitation. "But I imagine this is more business-related." Leela nodded, but her curiosity burned. That evening, while Mrs. Harper was busy with the younger children, Leela returned to the office and quietly opened the desk drawer where the letter had been placed. She knew it was wrong, but the unanswered questions swirling in her mind demanded answers. The letter was brief, typed on Stanton Enterprises stationery. As Leela read the words, her stomach twisted. "To whom it may concern, please be advised that Stanton Enterprises will continue its monthly financial contributions to Street Helena Orphanage as per Mr. Edward Langston's instructions. These contributions are intended to support the well-being of the children and the maintenance of the facilities. Mr. Langston appreciates your discretion in this matter. Sincerely, Monica Hill, Executive Assistant." Layla's hands trembled as she folded the letter and returned it to the drawer. Discretion. Why does he need to hide this? She wondered. The thought stirred old feelings of distrust. Was Edward trying to buy his way into her life? Was his generosity just another way to ease his guilt? The confrontation. The following weekend, Edward invited Layla to his home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. It was the first time she had seen where he lived, and the sheer size of the house left her speechless. Yet, despite its grandeur, the place felt cold and empty, much like the man she once believed him to be. "Welcome," Edward said, his smile nervous as he led her inside. "I thought we could have lunch out on the patio. The view of the garden is beautiful this time of year." Layla nodded, her excitement tempered by the discovery of the letter. She followed him through the house, noting the pristine decor and lack of personal touches. The only room that seemed remotely human was his study, where she spotted an old sketchpad sitting on the desk. "Did you draw something new?" she asked, pointing to the sketchpad. Edward hesitated, then smiled. "Actually, I was hoping you might add something to it. A collaboration." Layla's heart softened briefly, but the unresolved questions gnawed at her. As they settled on the patio for lunch, she finally blurted out, "Why do you donate to the orphanage in secret?" Edward froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "I saw the letter," Layla said, her voice trembling. "The one from your assistant. Why do you need discretion for helping us?" Edward set his fork down, his expression pained. "Layla, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because it feels like you're trying to buy everyone's forgiveness." Edward's jaw tightened. "That's not true. I've been supporting the orphanage for years, even before I met you." "Why didn't you tell me?" Layla pressed. "If you've been helping all this time, why didn't you come for me sooner?" Edward leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was ashamed. I didn't think I deserved the chance to be in your life. I thought you'd hate me." Layla's eyes filled with tears. "You should have let me decide that. You can't just show up and expect everything to be okay." "I don't expect that," Edward said, his voice breaking. "I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but I'm trying, Layla. I'm trying to make things right." Layla stared at him, her emotions a storm of anger and longing. "Then stop hiding things from me," she said quietly. "If you want me to trust you, you have to be honest." Edward nodded, his eyes glistening. "You're right. I'll tell you everything. No more secrets." A step toward understanding. Later that evening, Edward drove Layla back to the orphanage. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they arrived, Edward hesitated before speaking. "Layla, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you'll give me a chance to earn it." Layla glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, "but I'm willing to try." Edward nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. As she stepped out of the car, he called after her, "Good night, Layla." "Good night," she replied, her voice soft. As Edward drove away, Layla stood in the fading light, clutching the photograph she now carried with her everywhere. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, their fractured bond could be mended. But she also knew that the road ahead would not be easy, for either of them. The shadows of the past. The following weeks were filled with tentative progress. Edward continued to visit Street Helena Orphanage, but now his efforts extended beyond Layla. He spent time with the other children, sharing stories, teaching chess, and even helping with schoolwork. His presence became less of a spectacle and more of a comfort, though for Layla, the scars of the past lingered like shadows. A discovery in the attic. One rainy afternoon, Layla found herself exploring the orphanage's dusty attic. She often retreated to the quiet space when she needed time to think. As the rain pattered against the roof, she sorted through old boxes and forgotten treasures, hoping to distract herself from the whirlwind of emotions stirred by Edward's re-entry into her life. She stumbled across an old wooden trunk marked with her mother's name, Clara Grace. Her heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Harper had mentioned that a few personal items belonging to her mother had been stored away after her passing, but Leela had never seen them before. With trembling hands, she opened the trunk. Inside, she found a few faded photographs, a journal, and a delicate locket. She picked up the locket first, her fingers brushing over its intricate design. When she opened it, she saw two tiny portraits, one of her mother and the other of a man she didn't recognize. Curiosity burned within her as she turned to the journal. The first few pages were filled with Clara's neat handwriting, chronicling her dreams, struggles, and hopes for her unborn child. But as Leela flipped further, the entries grew more fragmented and filled with pain. Edward came by today. I told him about the baby, but he didn't stay. He said it wasn't the right time, that his career came first. I begged him to reconsider, but he walked away. I don't know how to do this alone. I feel so lost, so scared. But for this baby, I'll find a way. She deserves a better world than the one Edward and I have made for her. I miss him, even though I shouldn't. I keep hoping he'll change his mind, that he'll come back for us. But every day, I lose a little more hope. Tears streamed down Leela's face as she read the final entries. Her mother's heartbreak was palpable, and it reignited the anger she had worked so hard to suppress. She closed the journal and sat in the dim attic, clutching the locket to her chest, confronting Edward. The next day, Edward arrived at the orphanage with tickets to an art exhibition he thought Leila might enjoy. But when he saw her standing at the gate, her face pale and her fists clenched, he knew something was wrong. "Leela?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She didn't respond. Instead, she thrust the locket and journal toward him. "Did you know about this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Edward took the items, his brow furrowing as he examined them. "I didn't," he said softly. "Where did you find these?" "In the attic," Leela replied. "They were my mother's. She wrote about you, about how you abandoned her. Do you know how much pain you caused her?" Edward's grip on the journal tightened, and he looked down, shame etched into his features. "Leela, I can't undo what I did. I was selfish and scared, and I hurt her in ways I'll regret for the rest of my life." "She loved you," Leela said, her voice breaking. "Even after everything, she still hoped you'd come back. But you never did." Edward's eyes glistened with tears. "I know, and I'll carry that guilt forever. But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, for you." Leela shook her head, stepping back. "It's not enough to just try. You can't fix this with art supplies and garden projects." Edward's shoulders sagged, his confident facade crumbling. "What can I do, Leela? Tell me how to make this right." "You can't," she said bitterly. "But you can stop pretending like everything's fine. It's not. It never was." A moment of reflection. Edward left the orphanage that day feeling more lost than ever. He sat alone in his sprawling estate, staring at the journal and locket on his desk. The words Clara had written echoed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of his failures. He thought about the life he could have had with Clara and Leela, the birthdays and milestones he had missed, the memories he would never get back. For years, he had buried himself in work, convincing himself that success could atone for his sins. But now, faced with the raw truth of his actions, he realized how empty his achievements truly were. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to hide from his past anymore. A family meeting. Edward requested a meeting with Mrs. Harper to discuss his plans. He explained his intentions to take a more active role in Leila's life, including arranging for her to visit his home on weekends and potentially transitioning into his care full-time. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Langston?" Mrs. Harper asked, her tone cautious. "Leila's trust is fragile. If you take this step, you need to be absolutely certain you're committed." "I've never been more certain of anything," Edward replied. "I know I've let her down, but I want to be the father she deserves." Mrs. Harper studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. But remember, this is about Layla's needs, not yours. She's been through enough heartache already." Rebuilding trust. When Edward shared his plans with Leila, she was skeptical. "You want me to come live with you? Just like that?" "Not just like that," Edward said gently. "I know this is a big step, and I don't want to rush you. We can start with visits, and if you're comfortable, we can talk about more." "Why now?" Leila asked. "Why couldn't you do this when I was little?" Edward knelt before her, his voice earnest. "Because I was a fool. I thought staying away was the best thing for you. But I see now that I was wrong. I want to be there for you, Leila, in every way I can." Leila searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, "but I guess I can give you a chance." Edward smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "That's all I could ask for." As the days turned into weeks, Edward worked tirelessly to prove his commitment. He attended Layla's school events, helped her with homework, and even let her redecorate a room in his house to make it her own. Slowly but surely, Leila began to let her guard down. But the journey was far from over. Both of them carried the weight of the past, and forgiveness was a process that couldn't be rushed. Yet for the first time, they were walking that path together, one step at a time. Steps toward redemption. A tentative first visit. One crisp Saturday morning, Edward arrived at Street Helena Orphanage to pick Leila up for her first visit to his home. He was punctual, as always, but his hands trembled slightly as he rang the doorbell. Mrs. Harper greeted him with a kind but measured smile. "Leila's ready," she said, motioning for him to wait in the foyer. A few moments later, Leila appeared, clutching a small backpack and wearing a guarded expression. "Hi, Leila," Edward said softly, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "Are you ready to go?" Leila nodded but didn't say much. Mrs. Harper placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember, you can call me any time if you need to," she said, her eyes meeting Edward's briefly. The unspoken message was clear. Don't mess this up. As they left the orphanage, Edward opened the car door for Leila, a gesture that caught her off guard. "You don't have to do that," she mumbled as she climbed in. "I want to," Edward replied simply. The drive to his home was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radio. Edward tried to break the silence with small talk about her favorite artists and school projects, but Leila's responses were brief. It wasn't until they arrived at his estate that her curiosity began to peek through her defenses. "This place is huge," she said as she stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the manicured gardens and towering facade. "It's just a house," Edward said, his tone humble. "It's the people in it that make it a home." Leila frowned slightly. "That sounds like something you read in a book." Edward chuckled. "Maybe it is." Exploring the estate. Edward gave Leila a tour of the house, keeping his explanations brief and letting her explore at her own pace. She wandered through the high-ceilinged rooms, her fingers brushing against polished banisters and velvet drapes. When they reached the study, she paused, her eyes landing on the familiar sketchpad on his desk. "Do you still draw?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Not as much as I used to," Edward admitted. "But I was thinking, maybe we could draw something together." Leila hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Edward retrieved a fresh sheet of paper and set it on the desk. They worked side by side, the room filled with the quiet scratch of pencils. Leila sketched a butterfly, its wings bold and asymmetrical, while Edward attempted a simple landscape. "You're pretty bad at this," Leila teased, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I know," Edward replied, laughing. "But I'm lucky I've got the best teacher." An unexpected connection. After lunch, Edward showed Leila the room he had prepared for her. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and the bed was adorned with a quilt in her favorite colors. A bookshelf lined one wall, already stocked with art supplies and novels. Leila's eyes widened as she took it all in. You did this for me. Edward nodded. I wanted you to have a space that felt like yours. Somewhere you could feel safe. Leela ran her fingers over the quilt, her expression thoughtful. It's nice, she admitted. As the afternoon wore on, Edward suggested a walk through the garden. They strolled along the gravel paths, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. Edward shared stories about his childhood, describing the mischievous adventures he had with his younger brother, who had passed away years ago. I didn't know you had a brother, Leela said, her tone softening. Edward nodded. His name was Henry. He was fearless, always getting us into trouble. I was the cautious one. Losing him taught me how precious time is, but I didn't learn that lesson soon enough when it came to you and your mother. For the first time, Leela saw a glimmer of vulnerability in him that felt genuine. Do you miss him? She asked. Every day, Edward replied. Just like I missed you, even if I was too afraid to admit it. A bridge rebuilt. By the end of the day, the tension between them had eased slightly. As Edward drove Leela back to the orphanage, she glanced over at him, her expression contemplative. Today wasn't terrible, she said, the corners of her mouth quirking upward. I'll take that as a win, Edward said, smiling. When they arrived, Mrs. Harper was waiting at the gate. How did it go? She asked Leela as Edward unloaded her backpack. It was okay, Leela replied, her tone noncommittal. But as she walked inside, she looked back over her shoulder and waved, a small gesture, but one that filled Edward with hope. Facing the critics. Edward's efforts didn't go unnoticed, but not everyone was convinced of his sincerity. Some of the orphanage staff, still wary of his past actions, questioned whether his involvement was a publicity stunt. Even Monica, his loyal assistant, expressed her concerns during a private meeting. You've come a long way, Edward, she said, her tone gentle but firm. But you need to be prepared for setbacks. Lila's trust isn't something you can earn overnight. I know, Edward replied. But I'm not giving up on her. She's my daughter, Monica. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to her. Monica sighed, her expression softening. Just don't push too hard. Let her come to you. A shared milestone. The next weekend, Leela invited Edward to attend her school's art showcase, where her butterfly painting had been selected for display. Edward arrived early, dressed in a simple suit that felt out of place among the casual attire of the other parents. He spotted Leela standing near her painting, her face lit with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Leela, he called, waving. She turned, her expression brightening when she saw him. You came, she said, sounding surprised. Of course, Edward replied. I wouldn't miss this for anything. As they stood together, admiring her work, a teacher approached and introduced herself. Leela's incredibly talented, she said. This piece is one of the highlights of the showcase. Edward beamed. She gets it from her mother. Leela glanced at him, her eyes softening. For the first time, she felt a flicker of warmth in the bond they were building, a small step toward the relationship she had always longed for, forgiveness and the future. The weeks that followed Lila's art showcase were a turning point in her relationship with Edward. Though their path was still fraught with moments of doubt and hesitation, both father and daughter began to lean into the fragile trust they were building. For Leela, it wasn't about forgetting the past, but finding a way to live with it. For Edward, it was about earning the role of a father, a role he had neglected for far too long. An unexpected visit. One chilly spring morning, Edward arrived at Street, Helena Orphanage unannounced, carrying a box of freshly baked pastries from a small cafe downtown. The children swarmed around him as he handed out the treats, their laughter filling the air. Lila watched from a distance, her arms crossed, but a faint smile tugging at her lips. Mrs. Harper approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You know, he's changed a lot since he first started coming here, she said. Leela shrugged. Maybe. But people can pretend when they want to. Mrs. Harper smiled knowingly. True. But actions speak louder than words, don't they? He's been consistent, Lila. That's worth something. Leila remained silent, her gaze fixed on Edward as he knelt to help a younger child tie her shoelaces. It was such a simple gesture, yet it stirred something in Leila. A quiet hope she wasn't ready to admit. A day of reflection. That afternoon, Edward invited Leila to join him for a drive. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, curiosity outweighing her reluctance. As they drove through the city and into the countryside, Edward seemed unusually quiet, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Where are we going?" Leila asked, glancing out the window. "There's somewhere I want to show you," Edward replied. "Somewhere important." They arrived at a small cemetery nestled among rolling hills. Edward parked the car and stepped out, motioning for Leila to follow. She hesitated but eventually joined him, her heart heavy with unease. Edward led her to a modest headstone engraved with the name Clara Grace Langston. Fresh flowers adorned the grave, their vibrant colors standing out against the gray stone. "This is your mother's resting place," Edward said softly. "I've been coming here every week for years." Leila's breath caught in her throat. She knelt by the grave, tracing her mother's name with trembling fingers. "Langston?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward nodded, his eyes glistening. "Your mother never gave up on me, even after I failed her. She gave you my name because she believed in the man I could be, the father I should have been." Leila's tears fell freely as she knelt beside the grave. "She deserved better," she said, her voice cracking. "She deserved someone who wouldn't leave." Edward knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're right," he admitted. "She did, and so do you. But I can't change the past, Leila. All I can do is honor her memory by being the father she wanted me to be." For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared grief binding them together. Leila felt a strange mixture of sadness and comfort, knowing that her mother's love had endured even in the face of heartbreak. A father's promise. Later that evening, as they drove back to the city, Leila broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me about her before?" "About the cemetery?" "I wanted to," Edward replied. "But I wasn't sure if you were ready. And maybe I wasn't ready either." Leila frowned, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I still don't know if I can trust you. It's like every time I start to believe you, I remember how much you hurt her." Edward pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face her. "Leila, I'll never stop trying to earn your trust. I'll never stop showing you how much you mean to me. But I also understand if you need more time. You don't owe me anything." Leila looked at him, her heart torn between anger and the flicker of hope that refused to die. "What if I can't forgive you?" Edward's expression softened. "Then I'll keep showing up. Because that's what you deserve, someone who won't give up on you." A shared beginning. The next weekend, Edward invited Leila to join him at Stanton Enterprises' annual charity gala. At first, she refused, insisting that she didn't belong in his world. But after some gentle persuasion, she reluctantly agreed. When they arrived at the grand venue, Leila was overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of it all. The glittering chandeliers, the elegantly dressed guests, and the towering ice sculptures. Edward noticed her hesitation and offered her his hand. "You don't have to do this if you're uncomfortable," he said. "We can leave any time." Leila took a deep breath and shook her head. "I'll stay, but only because I want to try." Edward smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Together, they navigated the event, Edward introducing her to colleagues and friends with genuine warmth. To Leila's surprise, many of them treated her with kindness, asking about her interests and praising her artwork. As the night went on, Leila began to feel more at ease. When Edward pulled her aside to introduce her to Monica, his longtime assistant, Leila found herself laughing at Monica's stories about Edward's early days at the company. "Your dad's come a long way," Monica said with a wink. "But don't let him fool you. He still can't dance." Leila giggled, glancing at Edward. "Is that true?" Completely true, Edward admitted, chuckling. But if you want, I'll give it a try. To her surprise, Layla took his hand and led him onto the dance floor. As they swayed awkwardly to the music, she realized something she hadn't before. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about erasing the pain, but finding a way to move forward despite it. A new chapter. In the months that followed, Layla and Edward continued to navigate their complicated relationship. There were setbacks and arguments, but there were also moments of laughter and connection that brought them closer together. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in Edward's garden sketching side by side, Layla looked up at him and said, "You know, you're not so bad for a dad." Edward grinned, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "And you're pretty amazing for a daughter." Layla smirked. "Don't push it." As they laughed together, surrounded by the vibrant colors of the garden, both father and daughter knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time, they faced the future not as strangers but as family. A new bond. The letter. Several weeks after the charity gala, Layla sat in her room at the orphanage, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She had been wrestling with a decision that weighed heavily on her heart. The progress she and Edward had made was undeniable, but fully trusting him, allowing him to be the father he claimed he wanted to be, still felt like stepping into the unknown. Finally, she picked up her pen and began to write. A day of reckoning. Edward arrived at the orphanage one Saturday morning, his usual confidence tempered by nervous energy. Mrs. Harper greeted him with her warm smile, but quickly handed him an envelope with Lila's name written in neat cursive. "She wanted you to have this before your visit," Mrs. Harper explained. "She's in the garden." Edward opened the letter carefully, his hands trembling as he read. "Dear Edward, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about Mom, about the life I've had and the life I want. I know you've been trying to show me that you care, and I can see that you mean it. But trusting you completely is still hard. I've been hurt before, and I don't want to get hurt again. That being said, I've decided to take a chance, not for you, but for me. I want to know what it's like to have a dad. I want to know if we can really be a family. So, if you're still willing to try, I'll try too. But please don't let me down. Lila." Edward's chest tightened as he read her words. The weight of her vulnerability, her willingness to take a risk on him, filled him with equal parts gratitude and determination. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket before heading to the garden. A step forward. Layla was sitting on a stone bench beneath a blooming cherry tree, sketching in her notebook. She looked up as Edward approached, her expression unreadable. "Got your letter," Edward said, sitting beside her. "Thank you for trusting me enough to write it." Layla shrugged, pretending to focus on her sketch. "Don't make a big deal out of it." "I won't," Edward promised, though his smile betrayed how much it meant to him. "But I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to keep earning that trust." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the sound of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves filling the air. Finally, Layla closed her notebook and looked at him. "Do you think Mom would be okay with this?" she asked softly. Edward's throat tightened. "I think she would be proud of you, Layla. Of your strength, your kindness, everything you are." Layla nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think she would be proud of you too, for trying. A new beginning." Later that week, Edward made arrangements for Layla to transition into his home permanently. The decision was bittersweet for both her and the staff at the orphanage. While Layla was excited about the prospect of building a life with Edward, leaving behind the only home she had ever known was daunting. On moving day, the children and staff gathered to bid her farewell. Mrs. Harper hugged her tightly, whispering, "You'll always have a place here, Layla. Don't forget that." Edward stood nearby, watching the emotional scene with a mixture of pride and trepidation. When it was time to leave, he held the car door open for her, just as he had on their first drive together. "You ready?" he asked. Layla hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think I am." A home at last. Edward's house, once a symbol of isolation and regret, slowly transformed into a space filled with warmth and life. Lila decorated her room with her favorite colors and hung her artwork on the walls. She and Edward established routines: movie nights, weekend breakfasts, and long walks in the garden. There were still challenges. Layla struggled with feelings of doubt, and Edward wrestled with the guilt of his past. But each time they faced a conflict, they came back to the promise they had made to each other: to try. One evening, as they sat on the patio watching the sunset, Leela turned to Edward and said, "I think Mom would have liked this." Edward smiled, his eyes misty. "I think so too." A new future. Months turned into years, and their relationship grew stronger. Edward continued to support the orphanage, not out of guilt, but because it was a cause he genuinely believed in. Leela flourished in her new environment, excelling in school and developing her talent for art. On her 16th birthday, Edward surprised her with a special gift: a completed painting they had worked on together, a vibrant depiction of a butterfly in flight, its wings asymmetrical and bold. "It's like us," Leela said, tracing the lines of the painting. "Different, but still beautiful." Edward hugged her tightly. "Exactly."